There exists a peculiar paradox in the architecture of desire. The moment someone becomes certain of your presence, convinced beyond doubt that you will remain regardless of their actions, something fundamental shifts in the invisible mathematics of attraction. What once felt electric becomes mundane. What once demanded their attention now fades into the background noise of their comfortable existence. This is not cynicism speaking, but simple observation. The kind that reveals itself in 1,000 small betrayals played out across relationships where one person stopped wondering if the other might walk away. Tonight, we examine the linguistic instruments that reverse this erosion. 5 carefully constructed phrases that reawaken the dormant instinct every human carries, that ancestral fear of losing something valuable before fully appreciating its worth. These are not manipulations in the crude sense, but rather surgical corrections to imbalances of power that silently consume relationships from within. Before we proceed further into this territory, understand clearly what we are building here. This knowledge serves those who have already given too much, bent too far, erased too many boundaries in the name of keeping someone close. What follows is not a manual for controlling others through manufactured insecurity, but rather a restoration of equilibrium, a reclamation of the respect that should have existed from the beginning. If your intent is to torment someone who treats you well simply to feel powerful, close this now and examine why you require such hollow victories. But if you recognize yourself as someone whose value has been taken for granted, whose presence has become invisible through over-availability, then these tools belong in your hands. The difference between strategic clarity and toxic manipulation lives entirely in your motivation and the boundaries you maintain even as you speak. Take a moment now, if you will, and leave in the comments a simple phrase that captures where you currently stand. Write this: I choose clarity over comfort. Let those words serve as your anchor point, a reminder that what we discussed tonight demands courage to implement because comfort is always easier than truth. And passivity always feels safer than reclaiming your position. Picture an ordinary evening. He is absorbed in his phone, barely registering your presence as you move through the shared space of your life together. You have become furniture, reliable, and invisible. For months, perhaps years, you have organized your existence around his schedule, his needs, his moods. The question, "What do you want to do tonight?" has become purely rhetorical, because your answer always bends toward his preference. Into this scene, you introduce 5 words that fracture his complacency like a stone through still water. I have plans this weekend, you say, not as an apology or negotiation, but as simple fact. Notice what happens in the silence that follows. His attention, previously scattered, suddenly focuses with uncomfortable intensity. Plans? He asks, and beneath that single word lurks a constellation of assumptions being violently reorganized. You have just reminded him, without raising your voice or manufacturing drama, that you possess a life independent of his needs. The fear activated here is not that you are leaving, but rather the more insidious recognition that you could leave, that you contain depths and desires he has failed to notice because you made yourself too available to ignore. The psychology operating beneath this phrase is ancient and remarkably consistent across human relationships. We are hardwired to assign value based partially on scarcity and competition. When something exists in infinite supply, freely given without condition or boundary, our primate brains instinctively categorize it as less valuable than resources requiring effort or risk to obtain. This is not pretty, but it is functional, shaped by countless generations where miscalculating value meant death or disadvantage. By introducing this simple phrase, you remind him that your time, attention, and presence are not infinite resources, but limited ones that others might claim if he continues his pattern of neglect. You need not elaborate on these plans or justify them. In fact, elaboration weakens the effect by revealing your need for his approval. Simply state the fact, then allow the silence to perform its work. If he pressures for details, respond with casual warmth but firm boundaries. Just things I need to take care of, you might say, smiling in a way that communicates contentment with your own company. The immediate action here is deliberate but not theatrical. Make actual plans, whether with friends, for a solitary project, or simply for your own restoration. The authenticity matters because you are not performing independence but embodying it. and he will sense the difference with the same instinct that detects performance in others. The ethical boundary in this territory requires vigilance. You are not creating false jealousy or inventing rival suitors to torment him. You are simply refusing to collapse your entire existence into his orbit, maintaining the separate identity that attracted him initially, before you mistakenly believed total merger proved love. This distinction separates strategic clarity from manipulation. One restores natural balance, while the other deliberately destabilizes for the pleasure of watching someone suffer. Your goal is not his suffering, but his awakening to your value. And if that awakening never comes, these boundaries still serve you by preserving the self you are slowly erasing. Consider now a different scene, one that plays out in conversations rather than actions. He complains about work, about friends who disappointed him, about the general unfairness of existence. You have trained yourself over time to become his emotional repair service, always ready with reassurance, always quick to defend him against reality's harsh edges. Tonight, when he launches into familiar lamentations, you offer something unexpected. "I can see why you feel that way," you say, your tone neutral and observational rather than rushing to soothe. Then, rather than continuing with the usual reassurances, you simply fall silent, allowing space to exist where once you would have filled it with comfort. This phrase, this acknowledgement without rescue, creates profound discomfort because it refuses to perform the emotional labor he has come to expect as his due. The fear it triggers is subtle but cutting. If you no longer automatically validate his perspective, if you observe rather than merge with his emotional states, then perhaps you are seeing him more clearly than he wishes to be seen. Perhaps you have begun evaluating rather than blindly accepting. And if you are evaluating, you might eventually conclude he fails to measure up to standards you never articulated but clearly possess. The mechanism at work here involves the withdrawal of unconditional positive regard, that automatic approval he has learned to expect, regardless of his behavior. When you provided constant reassurance, you communicated that his actions carry no consequences in your eyes, that your support exists independent of his choices. By stepping back into observation, you reintroduce accountability without lecturing or explaining. He must now wonder whether you still admire him, whether your continued presence represents genuine choice or mere habit. This uncertainty, carefully maintained, becomes the engine that drives renewed effort. The application extends beyond romantic relationships into any dynamic where your energy has become expected rather than appreciated. A friend who constantly drains without reciprocating, a family member who demands without considering your capacity, a colleague who assumes your assistance as automatic rather than voluntary. In each case, the shift from automatic support to neutral observation creates space for them to recognize what they risk losing through their patterns of taking. The practical implementation requires consistency. When someone unloads their frustrations, listen without immediately rushing to fix or validate. Let silence exist. If pressed for your opinion, offer observations rather than judgments. That sounds difficult instead of, "You're absolutely right to feel that way." You are not being cold, but rather refusing to be the mirror that only reflects their preferred self-image. The ethical consideration here demands that you maintain genuine compassion even as you withdraw automatic reassurance. You are not punishing someone for having feelings, but rather declining to take responsibility for managing those feelings on their behalf. This boundary protects both parties. It prevents your exhaustion from being consumed as fuel for someone else's emotional regulation, and it forces them to develop internal capacity they will never build while you serve as their external processing system. If you find yourself enjoying the discomfort your withdrawal creates, if you feel satisfaction in watching them flounder without your support, pause and examine that response. Strategic boundary setting done correctly should feel grounding rather than vindictive, a return to your own center rather than a campaign against another's peace. Now we arrive at perhaps the most potent instrument in this collection, the phrase that requires the most courage, because it directly confronts the unspoken contract many relationships operate under, where one person gradually surrenders choice to maintain proximity. If you find yourself watching your words carefully around someone, take a moment and type "silence" in the comments below, acknowledging that you recognize the dynamic we are dismantling here. He makes a suggestion, an assumption about your weekend, your evening, your availability. In the past, You would have rearranged yourself to accommodate because saying no felt too risky, too likely to create conflict or withdrawal. Tonight, you offer 7 words that rewrite the entire power structure. I'll think about it and let you know. Observe how this lands. Not a rejection, but not automatic agreement either. You have just claimed the time and space to consult your own desires before committing, treating his request as one factor among many rather than the determining variable in your decision-making process. The fear this generates is immediate and specific. If you need to think about it, then his desires do not automatically override yours. If you will let him know, then your answer remains uncertain. He cannot plan around your automatic yes because that yes no longer exists as guaranteed outcome. The psychological foundation here involves reclaiming decisional sovereignty, that basic right to choose that somehow erodes in relationships where one person becomes overly invested in avoiding conflict or abandonment. Every time you said yes when you meant maybe or no, you trained him to expect compliance. Every time you suppressed your preference to align with his, you communicated that your wants matter less than his comfort. This phrase begins the long process of reversing that training, not through confrontation, but through quiet insistence on your right to consider choice. The application requires you to actually follow through. When you say you will think about it, engage in real deliberation. Ask yourself what you genuinely want, separate from what would be easiest or what would make him happy. Then deliver your answer, whether yes or no, without apology or excessive explanation. I've thought about it, and that doesn't work for me. Stands complete as a sentence. You need not justify or defend. This works equally in professional context, where bosses or colleagues assume your availability, in family systems where guilt drives compliance, in friendships where one person's plans always take precedence. The immediate action is simple but difficult. Practice the phrase until it feels natural. Say it aloud to yourself. Notice the fear that arises at the thought of using it in real interaction. That fear is the measure of how much you have surrendered, how much you must reclaim. The ethical framework demands that you mean what you say. If you claim you need to think about something, actually deliberate rather than using the phrase as passive-aggressive punishment disguised as boundary setting. If your true answer is no, say no directly rather than hiding behind false consideration. The power in this phrase comes from its honesty, from your genuine willingness to consult your own needs before responding to someone else's request. When used authentically, it builds respect. When used manipulatively to create anxiety, it builds resentment that eventually corrodes whatever connection exists. Shift now to a phrase that operates through redirection rather than withdrawal. You have become accustomed to making yourself the solution to his problems, the answer to his boredom, the entertainment for his empty hours. When he reaches out, you drop everything to respond because somewhere you internalize the belief that your value derives from your availability. Tonight, when he contacts you with that familiar expectation in his tone, you respond with unexpected words. I trust you'll figure that out. You say warm but final, refusing the role of problem solver he has assigned you without your explicit consent. In those 6 words, you accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. You communicate confidence in his capability, removing the insult that might come from simply refusing to help. You establish that his challenges belong to him to solve, not to you to rescue him from. And you create a boundary around your energy that forces him to recognize he has been treating you as an extension of himself rather than a separate person with your own demands on your time and attention. The fear this triggers cuts deeper than simple frustration at losing a convenience. It forces him to confront the possibility that you are developing standards for how you will and will not spend your limited resources of time and emotional energy. If you no longer automatically solve his problems, what else might you decline to provide? What other aspects of your overfunctioning have you begun to recognize and withdraw? The psychology here connects to the concept of learned helplessness and its inverse learned dependency. When you consistently rescue someone from the natural consequences of their choices or the minor difficulties of existence, you train them to stop developing their own problem-solving capacity. They learn that discomfort can be outsourced to you, and eventually they stop even attempting solutions before reaching for your intervention. By refusing this dynamic, you force capability to redevelop or reveal itself for the first time. This proves challenging because the immediate response will likely be frustration or increased pressure. He may escalate his requests, frame you as uncaring, or seek to activate guilt for your refusal to help, as you always have before. Your task is to remain steady through this temporary storm, trusting that people generally rise to meet challenges when their usual escape routes close. The practical application extends to any relationship where you have become the default fixer. A family member who never learned to manage basic adult tasks because you stepped in, a friend who creates the same crises repeatedly because you provide the same rescues, a partner who has never developed certain life skills because you handled them. In each case, the phrase, "I trust you'll figure that out," creates space for growth while maintaining kindness. You are not abandoning them, but rather refusing to disable them through excessive caretaking. The ethical consideration requires you to distinguish between genuine crises, requiring support, and manufactured urgency, designed to capture your attention and energy. Someone in actual danger or facing true emergencies deserves help. Someone who has never learned to solve minor problems because you always did it for them deserves the opportunity to develop competence, even if that development involves temporary discomfort. The line between these categories demands honest assessment rather than automatic response patterns. If you genuinely cannot tell the difference, you have likely been overfunctioning so long that your calibration has broken. Start with small declines and notice what actually happens when you stop rescuing. Often, you will discover people possess far more capability than they displayed while you were available to do things for them. We approach now a phrase that operates in the future tense, refusing the limitation of present circumstances. You have perhaps noticed how often he speaks about your relationship, your shared life, your mutual future in terms that assume but never ask, that plan but never consult. "We should do this," he says, or "we're going to that," always speaking as though your participation is automatic, rather than chosen. Into this pattern, you introduce a sentence that redirects the entire conversation. "I'll see where I am when that time comes." You say, not committing to the future he has outlined without your input. Notice the immediate shift in his demeanor. Suddenly, the future he considered settled becomes conditional. Your presence, which he factored as guaranteed, now appears as something he might have to earn or maintain rather than simply expect. The fear here is existential in nature. If you will not commit to the future he envisions, then perhaps you envision a different future altogether. Perhaps that different future does not include him at all. And if he wants to remain part of your trajectory, he cannot simply coast on past investment or current habit. He must actively maintain your interest, continuously demonstrate value, perpetually give you reason to choose him again rather than assuming you chose him once and that choice persists automatically forever. The underlying principle here challenges the toxic assumption that love, once declared, obligates future presence regardless of how someone behaves. Too many people treat commitment as a permanent surrender of choice, a one-time decision that removes all subsequent agency. By refusing to commit to a future you cannot yet evaluate, you preserve your right to ongoing consent, to continuous choice-making based on evolving information about who this person proves themselves to be over time. This represents not flightiness, but rather mature understanding that people change, circumstances shift, and what worked once may not work perpetually. The application here requires subtle calibration. You are not threatening to leave or holding the relationship hostage. You are simply declining to make promises about a future self whose desires and circumstances you cannot fully predict. When someone proposes a plan for 6 months from now, respond with provisional interest rather than guaranteed commitment. That sounds potentially good. Let's check in closer to the date preserves possibility while refusing false certainty. This works in professional contexts where bosses assume your long-term availability, in family dynamics where obligations are treated as permanent regardless of your evolving life, in any situation where someone wants to lock in your future self without considering that future self's needs and desires. The ethical boundary here insists on genuine uncertainty rather than fake it as a manipulation tactic. If you know you want to attend that event or take that trip, say yes clearly rather than withholding commitment to create anxiety. The power in this phrase comes from authentic acknowledgement that you cannot guarantee future desires or circumstances. When used honestly, It protects both parties from the resentment that builds when we honor commitments that no longer align with who we have become. When used manipulatively to keep someone perpetually uncertain of your intentions, it creates justified insecurity that prevents genuine intimacy from developing. The final phrase in our collection might appear gentle on the surface, but carries profound implications for the power dynamics that have calcified over time. He finishes speaking, perhaps sharing a story or making a point he considers important, and waits for your response with that expectation of focus and engagement he has come to assume as his due. You offer 3 words that reframe the entire interaction. That's interesting. You say, "Your tone pleasant but non-committal," and then you return your attention to whatever occupied you before he spoke. You have not dismissed him or insulted him. You have simply declined to treat his every utterance as the most fascinating thing you have encountered. You have calibrated your response to match the actual significance of what he shared rather than inflating its importance through your reaction. The fear this generates is cumulative and insidious. If you no longer hang on his every word, if your attention has become something he must earn rather than expect, then he loses the constant validation that came from your automatic fascination. He must now question whether he still captivates you, whether your interest has waned, whether someone else might be occupying the mental space he previously dominated. And unlike overt threats or dramatic statements, this shift happens through barely noticeable recalibrations that he feels but cannot easily name or challenge without sounding absurd. The mechanics here involve withdrawal of excessive positive attention that creates false impressions of significance. When you treat ordinary statements as profound, mundane observations, as brilliant insights, routine stories as captivating narratives, you create a distorted feedback loop where someone loses calibration on their actual impact and interest level. They begin to believe they are more fascinating than they actually are because your reactions suggest this, regardless of the content they produce. By matching your response to the actual value of what they offer, you restore accurate feedback that serves them even as it recalibrates the relationship. The application requires you to notice how much you have been over-responding to maintain someone's interest or avoid their displeasure. Do you laugh too enthusiastically at mediocre jokes? React with exaggerated interest to boring stories? Praise ordinary achievements as though they were extraordinary? Each of these patterns teaches the other person that they need not actually be interesting or impressive to receive your highest quality attention. Begin offering proportional responses. Mild interest for mildly interesting things. Genuine enthusiasm for actually impressive achievements. Natural laughter for genuinely funny moments. This recalibration extends to all relationships where you have inflated your responses to manage someone else's emotions or secure their continued approval. Friends who mistake your excessive validation for proof they need not grow. Family members who never develop self-awareness because you always praised regardless of actual merit. Colleagues who believe their mediocre work is excellent because you never offered honest feedback. The ethical imperative here insists on honesty as kindness. By offering accurate feedback through your calibrated responses, you give people information they need to develop real competence rather than false confidence. The temporary discomfort of receiving proportional rather than inflated attention serves their long-term growth. However, this requires you to maintain basic respect and kindness even as you withdraw excessive validation. "That's interesting," said with contempt or obvious dismissal crosses from honest calibration into punitive withdrawal. The goal is accurate feedback, not punishment for failing to fascinate you every moment. If you find yourself enjoying the deflation of someone's ego, you have moved into problematic territory that requires self-examination. We have now examined 5 linguistic instruments that share a common architecture despite their different surfaces. Each phrase creates psychological space where none existed before. Each refuses overfunctioning that has become habitual. Each communicates through action rather than lecture that you possess value independent of his recognition, that your presence represents choice rather than obligation, that you maintain standards and boundaries even within intimate connection. The fear they trigger is not fear of your cruelty or manipulation, but rather fear of your clarity. Fear that you see yourself and the dynamic accurately and have decided you will no longer participate in your own diminishment. This fear, properly understood, is the beginning of respect, Not respect that comes from intimidation, but respect that emerges when someone recognizes they stand before a person who knows their worth and protects it, who offers connection freely but not desperately, who chooses presence but never surrenders the capacity to choose differently if circumstances warrant. For the next 7 days, I challenge you to implement one phrase per day in an appropriate context. Not artificially creating situations to deploy them, but rather noticing the organic opportunities that arise when you pay attention. Notice what happens in your body when you say these words. Notice what happens in the space between you and the other person. Notice whether the fear you feel at potentially triggering their displeasure or withdrawal exceeds the discomfort of continuing patterns that serve neither of you well. And if you discover this fear dominates your choices, that revelation itself becomes valuable information about the work ahead. You cannot simultaneously protect someone else's comfort and honor your own boundaries. Eventually, you must choose which matters more, their undisturbed peace or your reclaimed self. Tell me in the comments which of these phrases feels most difficult to imagine yourself saying. That difficulty marks your growing edge, the territory where your transformation awaits if you possess the courage to enter it. And if what we have explored tonight resonates with the clarity you have been seeking, know that more of these strategic revelations await in future conversations. For those willing to subscribe and continue this uncomfortable but necessary education in the dynamics of power, perception, and the preservation of self within relationship.